As art historians look back on reliefs throughout our history, this type of artwork can be seen in cultures like ancient Egypt, Assyria, and other Middle Eastern areas. Low reliefs were common among ancient Egyptian art, and high reliefs were made by the ancient Greeks, as they were able to explore the medium. The ancient Romans as well created relief sculptures which varied as Roman art moved away from the imperial classical style to more experimental styles. Hello, I'm Rachel Torres. I wanted to go over specifically these two reliefs, the column of Antonius Pius and the column of Trajan from the Roman Empire era, which lived from 753 BCE to 337 CE. The relief that surrounds the column of Antonius Pius and the column of Trajan in Rome, Italy come from the same time period, but they have grand differences in their individual style, the history around their creation, and their meaning. I will be discussing the physical differences between the two column reliefs, like how they were made different from each other, and how it affects the meaning behind the reliefs. Overall, the main theme is the differences between reliefs from the same time period, ancient Rome. This here is the column of Antonius Pius. Artists behind most Roman artworks are unknown, but we do know the column was commissioned by Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, the adopted sons of Antoninus Pius. At a glance, the column of Antonius Pius has four sides. Two are identical decursos, one with text and the other with an apotheosis. Right off the bat, we can see that the column is a high relief sculpture. You can tell based on how much the art projects off the surface of the column. Because of the high relief, we can see the stark contrast of the lights and darks of the piece. Looking here, the shadows are dark and wherever the light hits the sculpture is the lightest. This creates a wide variety of value within the piece. If this column was low relief, there would be little contrast, mostly middle values and not as realistic. The column of Antonius Pius leaves an empty space as the background for the reliefs. The decurso relief has a neutral background. The marching soldiers and horses are depicted floating in midair. That is partly due to the challenge of creating perspective in a relief style. The decurso uses the surface of the pedestal as a flat plane from a bird's eye view rather than the viewer looking through a window at the scene. The other side of the pedestal, the apotheosis, has more of a classical relief style. It too has a neutral background. The details in the wings and the realistic drapery all create a sense of movement in the relief, yet the body stays stiff, which is typical of the classical style. The column does have a pattern along the top border and the bottom border of this relief in cobblestone. It acts like a frame for the entire artwork. The style of the apotheosis relief has the classical style of Imperial Roman art, which this column was made in. The Imperial Roman style was influenced by Greek art from the classical and Hellenistic era. The style showed smoothness and lines, detailed drapery, and well-proportioned nude bodies. The decurso relief is significantly different from the apotheosis. It breaks from the classical style. The surface is the ground, so the relief is unexpected and abstract. The decurso looks more like folk art with Eastern influence and isn't very classical because the figures are short and stocky. The column of Antonius Pius is an important part of Roman relief art. Not only is it considered significant as a Roman imperial sculpture, but it is a transitional piece that marks the beginning of experimentation in the Roman relief style. The column of Trajan was designed by Apollodorus of Damascus. It has a spiral frieze that is later mimicked in the Middle Ages. As part of the frieze, there are bands that circle the column and get bigger as it reaches to the top, to make it easier to see for those down below. The spiral relief is a low relief sculpture, so the sides of the column are not misshapen. The relief is considered a narrative relief because it tells the story of the Dacian Wars all throughout the relief. Because it is a low relief, the figures are limited in values and contrast. The sculptors solved that problem when the column was first made by painting the entire relief. Doing that brought out the readability of the figures, but now most of the paint is gone. The freestanding column leaves no empty space. The episodes weave into each other, and buildings and landscapes were drawn to fill up spaces. The backgrounds don't come off the wall very much, and the style they are drawn in is very reminiscent of the Byzantine style of building perspective. It was to show the locations and the surroundings in deep detail. The amount of detail incorporated in the relief is extensive, so much so that it actually makes the iconography of the past and their items easier to read. Historians can clearly see the types of equipment, weapons, and clothing from the Roman era. Even though the spiral bands give the relief some movement, the people are static. They are all the same size, even though their perspective would either put them further behind and smaller or towards the front and bigger of the relief. The drapery is also not very classical. The style of this column has Eastern influence because it shows that it is archaic and unproportional from the background all the way to the people. Overall, the relief is leaning away from the classical style. To some, the column of Trajan is considered very similar to the column of Antoninus Pius. However, the frieze has distinguished itself as being one of the first reliefs with a completely different art style to the imperial classical style in ancient Rome. Obviously, the column of Antoninus Pius and the column of Trajan have different styles. This first relief still incorporates the imperial classical style and has a much higher degree of relief than the spiral, but it still breaks norms by including the unclassical relief on two other sides. The frieze, however, has a more exhaustive relief sculpture that is low relief and a more complex construction. Its style has completely deviated from the classical style. The column of Antoninus Pius was made with white marble with a red granite shaft. It is around 8 feet high. The only part remaining of the column is the decorated pedestal. The relief was made by carving into the marble so sculptures can stick out. And that's basically it. The column of Trajan was made from Luna marble and is 128 feet tall. Apollodorus of Damascus figured out how to make a frieze with reliefs. The shaft has 19 marble drums, so when they set them up, sculptors were able to start carving out the relief. Doing this required a lot of skill and patience because they had to handle their materials from such a high altitude for such a long time. The column of Antoninus Pius had it easier. The spiral frieze was very ambitious with the style they wanted to show off, and it paid off. Although these columns were created in the Roman time period, their styles are very different. Most of the later ancient Roman art is different from each other, and viewing reliefs is one way to see that difference because it is not only the style of how figures are depicted, it is also the style of the column and the pedestals and how they are made. A main part of ancient Roman reliefs is trying out new styles and new methods. As I previously said, the column of Antoninus Pius was commissioned by Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus for their adopted father Antoninus Pius after he passed. Antoninus Pius was an emperor of Rome, one of the 5 good emperors. He was adopted by the emperor before him, Hadrian, at the age of 55 years old. He reigned from 161 CE to 180 CE. When emperors die, they undergo a deification process where they are raised to the status of god. After Antoninus Pius died, his sons became co-emperors and had the column made to memorialize him. Previously, the pedestal had a bronze portrait of Antoninus Pius and was a monolith. Now only the pedestal remains. Roman reliefs are typically read from left to right. Apotheosis reliefs are scenes that depict someone being brought up to a divine status. The column's apotheosis iconography shows, from the left, the personification of Campus Marus holding an Egyptian obelisk that represents imperial unification. Next is a relief portrait of Antoninus Pius and Faustina riding on the back of an unknown winged deity to the afterlife. Faustina has passed 20 years before Antoninus, and he has stayed loyal to her in that time. The right of the relief is the personification of the Roman Empire Roma. She is leaning on a shield that has Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, drinking wolf's milk. Other items in the apotheosis are just Roman symbolism. The decursio reliefs depict a cavalry surrounding standing soldiers practicing an ancient Roman ritual of an imperial prior. The column of Trajan was dedicated to Emperor Trajan, one of the 5 good Roman emperors. He reigned from 98 to 117 CE. The base of the column became a tomb for Trajan's ashes later in life. After a commander wins a battle or war, the triumph commences, which is like a Roman ritual of celebrating. The column of Trajan was made for Emperor Trajan after he won the Dacian Wars. Basically, the neighboring people, the Dacians, which is in modern Romania, were seen as trouble to the Romans. Plus, they had gold, so Trajan fought their leader, Decebalus, and won the First and Second Dacian Wars. After that, Trajan declared 100 days of celebration. The lower half of the column shows the First Dacian War. The top half depicts the Second Dacian War. The column could be considered propaganda. The reliefs show Romans as clean-shaven and modern, while the Dacians were shaggy with leggings to show that they were like barbarians. Art from the Roman era liked to honor ancestors, show historical or mythological scenes, personify figures, and memorialize battles. All this was likely because Roman patrons wanted to display important relatives, historical moments, and their intelligence of Roman culture. The column of Antoninus Pius and the column of Trajan, although both have very different styles of portraying their message, still fit into why Romans made art, and of who. The main reason for the shift in style is because artists and patrons got tired of the classical art and wanted something different. These reliefs are the perfect example of that shift with their unconventional styles from classical art and from each other. But the reason for why and who the art is for line up with Roman art as a whole. These reliefs may look different, but their underlying meaning coincide with the ancient Roman era. As people look back on the reliefs in the Roman era, the main idea I want them to take away is that Roman reliefs are very different from each other, as the style tries to move away from the Greek classical style, whether it be the change of style, or the physical display, or the construction of the reliefs. The stories behind the column of Antoninus Pius and the column of Trajan have deep histories that casual viewers wouldn't have seen. Nevertheless, their historical contexts provide a deeper understanding of the reliefs. The meaning behind these reliefs are reminiscent of Roman art because the messages are very similar in reliefs. With the style so varied in Roman reliefs, people can identify Roman art based on the iconography, the symbolism, and the meaning behind the piece. As I was researching these reliefs, the more I read, the more interested I got in the subject, and I'm happy to share. So, have a great day.